Hello, Chevra. Okay, we're learning the Sicha of the Farbrengen, a Parsha Shlach, which is this week's Torah portion. Also, the blessing of the week of Tammuz, which is this week. The year Tavshin Lamed, which is equivalent to 1970. Parsha Zu Nikra B'Shem Shlach. This week's Parsha is called Shlach. It's called Shlach. Al Shem HaSchola, based on the beginning of the Parsha, which is Shlach L'cha Anashim, send out people, meaning spies. This is the story of the spies. We'll move in, it's understood, the Rebbe says, since the story of the spies is told in the Torah with many details, and then told over a second time, Moshe reminded the Jewish people before going into the Eretz Yisrael of the story a second time with all its details. It's very obviously a very important story. Therefore, it's told in length and in detail. Not just as a story that happened once upon a time, also as a lesson to today. Not just any kind of like a small lesson or insignificant lesson. Had it just been a small lesson, then we could have just told the story shorthanded or just in a hint. It must be a very important lesson that we need even till today. To every male and female, just starting page 479. Talking about the Miraglim, that obviously the fact that it says it in such details has to be that it's a lesson for all times, not just a small lesson, but a very significant lesson. Ukamuvin, the Rebbe says, is understood. From this, the outcome and the side effects and the continuing effects of the story of the spies, not only is the story and the lesson, but also the story actually trickles over and affects all the generations, not just the generation that was in the desert. Why? Because of the story of the spies, the Jewish people got stuck, held up in the desert an additional 40 years. That wasn't officially part of the initial plan. It's not just that they stayed in a longer time in the desert than Hashem would have liked. And after they finished the 40 years, then we, so to say, continued the way it was supposed to be initially, with the same oomph and energy and fanfare. Elegam ikuv bechos. The Rebbe says it affected the quality of how they went into Eretz Yisrael. The way the Jewish people entered the land after the sin of the spies, is in a totally different way. It was much different than had it been had they never had the sin and gone in right away, right after they left Har Sinai. As it's mentioned in many of the commentaries, had the Jewish people entered Eretz Yisrael immediately, how would it have been Adei Moshe? That means they would have went in with Moshe Rabbeinu. Had they went in right away, before the sin of the water that Moshe got punished that he wouldn't go in, and before the whole story, so that Moshe would have brought them in, then they never would have been able to be exiled from the land. No nation would be able to exile us physically, never mind spiritually, from the land of Eretz Yisrael. But now that the sin happened, Hamiraglim of the spies, then we entered their land. Moshe, not via Moshe, Yeshua, we were brought into the land through Joshua. Even though from a young age he was an attendant, he was a Talmud Muvak, he was a student of Moshe Rabbeinu. Moshe received the Torah from Sinai, and the Mishnah continues that the whole Torah, as he received it, he gave it over to Joshua. However, but nevertheless, because going in through with Joshua, and after 40 years, so then it happened that we could be exiled from the land. Whether it was after the first or the second destruction of the temples. So what do we see from this? That the effect of the story of the spies is not just a story that happened 3,500 years ago, because we're suffering literally today because we didn't go in with Moshe Rabbeinu. It's the effects till today. Therefore, we have to understand it's not just that we're also suffering from the story, but the lesson of the story is relevant to us. It's a fundamental lesson. When we learn the story again each year, when the parsha of Shlach comes up, even though we're not sitting technically now in the desert with the spies and all that, and it's a spiritual experience, nevertheless, we have to learn from the story of the Meraglim how to behave. Okay. The Rebbe says this also applies to other stories of the parsha. Because the whole parsha is called Shlach, all the different details of the story, which means the other main stories is the Makoshish Eitzim, the one who is cutting wood, the story of Chala, the story of serving Avodah Zarah b'Shogeg, and of course the final mitzvah, the story of Tzitzis, are all connected somewhere or another to the story of the Meraglim. Also, he talks about the idea of the pouring of the wines. I forgot that one. Rashi himself says, what is the connection between the additional laws of the pourings? What are the pourings? That we had wines and oils that were part of the sacrifice. So Rashi says, as he says, page 480, as it would be understood even to a simple 5-year-old who's studying Chumash. So too, also the other things of the parsha are connected to the story of the spies. Rashi doesn't point it out because it may be a little too deep to connect for the 5-year-old, but nevertheless, everything is connected with the story of Shlach. And also included in that is the laws of tzitzis. Even the parsha of tzitzis, the laws of the tzitzis of the talis is connected to the story of the spies. The Rebbe says even more so the laws of tzitzis than the parts in between, because we know the rule that the beginning and end of something are wedged together. So if the beginning of the parsha is about the spies and the end of the parsha is about the laws of tzitzis, obviously it really connected the two ideas. In the mitzvah tzitzis shebesayfa parsha shaychas leinin amaraglim shabas cholos parsha yosim inyanim shebeemsa parsha kfi shispar lekamam. Derech Agav, the Rebbe is going to explain later. I highly doubt we'll get to that part. Let's just get to the first part of the Rebbe's explanation of the lesson from the story of the spies itself. Okay, Sif Beis. First, we have to understand about the story of the spies. Obviously, we have many talks of the Rebbe and many ideas in Chassidus and elsewhere that try to understand the story of the spies. So let's see what the Rebbe says here in 1970, in the same setup as our year of 5,784, 2024. Al Meraglim Nembar, with regards to the spies, it says, Kulam Anashim, they were all people. Lashon Chshivus means they were respectable people. When he gave them the name Anashim, means they were respectable people. Leirak Begashim is not just that they were maybe physically, materially wealthy people. Also in the God-fearing people. They were literally special people, even on a God-fearing level, which makes the question even stronger. How did they end up going so off? At the time that Moshe chose them for the job, obviously he didn't choose people that were questionable. He chose top quality people spiritually. Rashi b'nei Yisrael, the heads of the Jewish people. Kol Nasibem, each one was a leader. They were all Nasiim, they were all princes chosen by Moshe himself. He chose them for their qualities, that they were up to the task of the job. How is it possible? The obvious question. How did they make such a grave mistake to think the Jewish people can't enter the land? And they also convinced, not just that they thought so, they also felt it important to convince the Jewish people that they won't be able to enter the land. That the people they brought the people to such a dark picture, they painted such a dark picture of the scenario that the people cried the whole night. And they were so affected by the words of the spies, the 10 spies, because 12 went, 10 spoke bad, that when the Joshua and Kalev tried to change their minds and they stood in Mesiras Nefesh, self-sacrifice, and their lives were at risk. That we can, don't worry, we can enter the land. We disagree with our colleagues. Don't be fearful of the people, right? Aren't we hearing today, every time we open the news, how 100,000 scenarios of how things are going to go wrong? And the people said, "What? You crazy? Let's stone Joshua and Caleb. They're putting it at they're risking our lives." They didn't feel like they were overreacting. They felt that Caleb and Yeshua were being harmful to them by even suggesting that we could go into the land. And therefore, they were chayv misa. They were trying to hurt them by suggesting they try to enter the land when the 10 spies painted such a dark picture. The Rebbe says it can't be that they just came mamish from no place, from a place of total evil. There has to be that there was some sort of root in holiness to give basis to their claim. Doesn't make sense if they didn't think in their minds. The Rebbe is building a case where people, not every time a person has disagreement with what the Torah says, is the foundation for the disagreement with malicious anti-God thoughts. They think they're representing God, right? There's so many people you think till today, we're representing, this is God's opinion. If the Torah says differently, it's because the Torah has to change to the scenario. Whatever their thinking is, let's see what the Rebbe explains here. But in their minds, they thought this is what God wants in some sort of weird way. What's the explanation? The Alter Rebbe applies the first few Maimarim of Likutei Torah in Parshas Shlach to this question. So as the Alter Rebbe explains in the Likutei Torah, Pirish Tanis Meraglim, when the spies said that the people are too strong for us, it's not something we could achieve. The Alter Rebbe explains that what was the root of their concern? The root of the concern was that the Jewish people won't withstand the challenges of entering the land on a spiritual level. The challenges in the desert, in a protected space, page 481, that they could handle. And it's surrounded by the clouds in a protected space with Moshe. They're not out in the world. But now that they would enter the land, and not only that, and just to get into the land, so they have to encounter outside forces. Amalek Yeshiv Eretz HaNegev, the Amalekim sit in the south. Shezeh Makim Chodesh, that this is a new place, and they're not anymore in the desert. B'yamdu b'fneim nisyonis chadashim, there's new challenges that are unfamiliar to them. Azai layochel amid bem, they're not going to be able to withstand the challenges. We're not just talking about the wars. We're talking about the spiritual challenges, the assimilation, all the questions that now the people, they looked at the people and they looked at what's going on in the land. They said, we're not up to the task. They were not going to be able to withstand the test. They said, we better stay in the midbar. This is the Alter Rebbe explains in Likutei Torah. That making an evaluation, understanding the people they represented, and understanding the situation in Eretz Yisrael, meaning the interaction they're going to have with other nations, and starting with Amalek and all the Amalek's conniving ways. They said, we're not up to the task. The Rebbe says, but what the Alter Rebbe explains, we have to understand. The Rebbe's hitting the question straight in the middle of the target. So what? So what if we have challenges? Since when are we scared of challenges? So what if there's a nisayon, a test? Why are we concerning ourselves that there's a test and therefore there's a challenge? God told us to go to the land. We go to the land. There's no questions. It doesn't make a difference if we feel we're up to the task or not. We have a clear message from God, a commandment. Go to the land. So we'll understand, as explained in many places. When a person has belief, this is a question now, right? This idea tackles us in many times in our life. We know what we have to do, but we see the challenge. So the Rebbe says, when it comes to belief in God, our belief sometimes could stay in an encompassing way. What's encompassing? It doesn't penetrate inside. We know in our minds we have to believe, but we can't bring that belief into our feeling. Like the Rebbe spoke, I guess, in Parshas Baloischa, that's the same year of 1970. If a person could be in such a situation, Shehudi mamin b'Hashem. A person knows there's a God. I believe in God. But that belief stays in an encompassing. You don't internalize that belief. And you don't internalize it. What does that mean? How do you know if you've internalized belief? If you can act on that belief. Can you act? Can you make decisions in your life based on the belief you have in God? Gemara, as the famous Gemara says, Ganva, a thief, he's about to enter. He's standing on the threshold of entering a house, and he asks God for help, that he should be successful, he shouldn't get caught, right? At the same time, when he's about to do something that God doesn't asks him not to do. If he's praying to God, he's not just mouthing it, he's quiet, no one's around him, right? He's a thief. So he believes God can help him if he wanted to. Therefore, he's asking God for his help. And he knows he knows God doesn't want him to do this robbery. Therefore, he has to come in at night. He's sneaking in through the basement. Because if he's going to be caught, he'll be in trouble. So he prays to God, don't let them catch me. If he believes God can help him, why doesn't he believe God can provide for him in a different way? If you believe God can help you, so God can also provide for you, then you don't have to steal. So if you believe in God, so why are you standing there in the basement about to go into someone else's home? So the answer is, as explained many times in Chassidus, if you believe in God, but it hasn't internalized itself for you to act on it. So therefore, you don't trust God to provide for you, but you're praying for God to help you, that you should be successful in your robbery and not get caught. It doesn't mean the person doesn't believe. Where you believe in God, that's true to you. You don't bring it properly into your mind to understand that it's a contradiction to believe in God and at the same time to pray to Him to be successful. And this doesn't just mean, the Rebbe explains, we learned this many times in the Sichos, this doesn't just mean a person standing by the door. This expresses itself in many fine things in our life. When we have contradictions in our belief of Hashem and in how we behave. If you really believed in Hashem, you would trust Him and you wouldn't do things that are questionable. It doesn't penetrate your mind that you should think that really that God could also provide for you without you having to do this. He knows God will give you, that God can give him livelihood. He also knows that God says you have to make a vessel. As the verse says, bless Hashem, your Lord, that God's blessing comes down in everything you do. What does it mean, everything you do? You have to create a vessel. Had your belief in God properly penetrated your mind, your thinking, so to say, so then you would make the vessel not as in stealing, as being your vessel, but something that makes sense according to the belief. That you make a vessel that's a proper vessel for God's blessing. But because it doesn't penetrate your mind properly, you haven't internalized this belief. And hasn't entered your mind properly. And even though you do believe, but your mind doesn't see any other options. It means if you believe in God, but your mind doesn't see any other options, this is your only option out of your problem. So therefore, you do something, you pray to God because you believe in God, but you're not able to, your mind is not able to see any other options. But had it penetrated your mind, you would say there must be other options because I believe in God. Besides, the only vessel you think you can make, you can move forward is to make this thievery. And just as it says this about belief and how you internalize the belief into your mind, so too is affected. This applies, page 482, to our mind and our feelings, meaning also means the same thing. That's just like belief surrounds your thinking and therefore that you think that the only option you have is to break into the basement, even though you know that God says you have to make a vessel, but this is the only vessel you could think. So your emunah doesn't penetrate your thinking. So too, your thinking doesn't always penetrate your feeling. Sometimes you know things in your mind, but you can't feel it. You emotionally can't connect to what you understand. So the Rebbe says, "Shari seichel nikra makal v'gav midos." Our seichel, our intellect, also surrounds our emotions. And even things that are below our feelings. A lot of times we understand things in our mind. This is the way it should be, this is the way I should behave. Or even sometimes that's like anxiety, right? And anxiety is not always that you think that it means your mind tells you it's okay, relax, but you can't emotionally connect to that information. So therefore, it can be a person may understand in their mind that this is the way things should be. However, you don't feel it. Whether it's Avas Hashem, loving God, fearing God, in general, trust, bitachon, things will be okay. So a lot of times our mind the emunah penetrates our mind, but in our hearts, it's hard to get it inside. The Rebbe says when we ask a Jew, is it possible? Do you really think there's no boss to this world? Everything's just going on like this, that there's things are chaotic without a plan? Yeshiv, the Jew's going to answer, what are you talking about? Of course there's a God in this world, meaning there's a balabais, there's ownership to this world. What do you mean? My mind understands. The world didn't create itself. All the intellectual arguments that there is a God. Therefore, the person says, of course, God created the world. Not just the general world. All the details of creation. We don't believe that God created a point and then the world evolved. And the details evolved on their own. Hey Lauren, if everything is a creation, even every detail of creation was created by Hashem, seemingly. If God created everything, and He's our vitality, our life, if that's the case, we must love Hashem. We must fear Hashem. To fear the Creator. So we know there's a God. We know that God created everything. Nevertheless, even though we know this in our mind, with all the proofs and details, we could talk about it. If we don't feel it, we're not feeling the love. We should love God, we should fear God, and naturally, based on our knowledge that God created the world. So where's the disconnect? Because what our mind understands doesn't always stays makif, isn't encompassing to our heart, and doesn't penetrate the heart. It hasn't, the information hasn't penetrated that we should feel the love and the fear. To God. Whatever the reason is, whatever the disconnect is, there's many explanations in Chassidus. For instance, the Rebbe says, Meitzer Gorein, right? The head is here, and the heart is there in the torso. What's in between? The neck. And that's narrow. The neck is a narrow space. So in that narrow space, Chassidus explains, it's hard to get the intellect into the heart. Yes, Aaron.
Misagarim means what?
Meitzar is the word, a limited space of the neck. The garin is the throat. The throat is a small space, so it's hard to take what we understand to our heart because it has to go through a narrow space, and that narrow space doesn't allow, so to say, and there's a lot of obstacles in that narrow space. Power stands there. All the voices in your head that says, well, maybe you shouldn't believe in God, sit there at that point to stop what you understand to how you feel. Okay, so whether it's idea of Meitzer Garin, whether it is that how you have a narrow space in between, or Timtim Halev, or your heart is just too heavy that you can't. It's like a stone. You can't, whatever your mind understands can't penetrate the heart. But the bottom line is that what you understand stays as an external point of information. It hasn't penetrated. It hasn't internalized. It hasn't penetrated the heart. Sometimes, even if you have it in your heart, what you know in your heart doesn't always come out in action, speech, and thought, right? You don't act how you feel. The liba palig lechol shayfen shegam kishemevim besichel nimshich beregesh alev yochel yishisha ba'ifem makav leimshich ma'aseh payil. It's also possible that even what you feel, so you believe in Hashem, you know it, you feel it, but still doesn't translate in action. Because everything it goes in a circle, internalizes, another circle internalizes, another circle internalizes, until it comes to the actual action, how you act, speak, and think. It's not a contradiction to how you feel. It's not a contradiction to what you know. It's not a contradiction to what you believe. But it hasn't translated into action. Therefore, he says, this is the story of the spies. The Meraglim said, the spies said, this whole experience of going into Eretz Yisrael is too heavy for us. It's too strong. Why would God take us to this situation that we're going to fall? There's so much work from what you understand, from what you believe, until how you act. There's so much work and there's so many obstacles. Better go back to Egypt. Seemingly, again, what's going on over here? Let's say, let's say, hypothetically, it is too heavy for us, that they're too strong for us. If you believe God took you to the land, right? You're standing here now, God took you out of Egypt, the mountain Torah, the temple, the tabernacle, so he's taking you to the land. So why are we asking questions? Why are we still asking questions? God is with us. Maybe to say if we understand it or not. Big intellectuals are going to come and argue, page 43. That on an intellectual level, the person is going to sit there in the desert around the coffee table and explain people psychologically, intellectually, mathematically why it doesn't make sense that we could go into the land. But you believe. Forget what the person is arguing. You believe in God. Why are we asking questions? Nevertheless, we see even though that they believe that God could take us to the land, not Moses himself, but God is going to take us to the land. They themselves saw. They saw the miracles. They themselves experienced the miracles. It wasn't a story of the past. And God promised them that the reason we're leaving Egypt and all the miracles is to go to the land. And the Meraglim said, yes, this is a land of flowing milk and honey. That is a good land. God, what he promised us is true. And they knew this already from Avram. It's not like there was a 5,000-year disconnect. There was 210 years from when they entered Egypt. But still, that belief hasn't penetrated them. It stayed as encompassing. It hasn't been internalized. It hasn't penetrated through all the stages that they could act on that belief. But the Rebbe still asks, how did it stay so encompassing? Why was it that way? So the Rebbe is explaining the technicalities of it. But why was it that they couldn't internalize the belief when it came that Moshe sent them to go spy the land and get the Jews ready and give back a good report? Why couldn't they internalize the belief? They had all these miracles. What was holding back? And it could be so the answer is when a person has an agenda, Pnias Ishis means an agenda. The first thing that fights a person's belief in Hashem is an agenda. The first force that fights that belief should penetrate the mind, heart, and action is when you have a personal agenda, because the personal agenda comes first. The Rebbe explains. I can explain it to people who deal with intellectual things. First, so it's like this. First, there's a hascholas hashak v'tayr. First, when you're intellectual, you first analyze. Shak v'tayr means you ask all the questions, the pros and the cons of a situation. This, but at the end of the day, everyone has a tendency to go. We see that, right? You could have an argument about any subject, and you could tell from the person's personality or agenda how they're going to think. What is why their agenda dictates how they think, how they apply their mind. You see that in a lot of the arguments that are today, the political and nationalistic disagreements that are going on both in Eretz Yisrael and outside of Eretz Yisrael are connected to personal agendas, right? So Shak Hashem is Arif Pniyas Ishis. A person has a natural tendency to go to a certain direction. Says you ask that person, you're intellectual. So you asked all the questions. So what do you think the bottom line is? Yashiv, that person will answer, I feel, or my idea is, my mind tells me that the bottom line is such and such. But in order to really have an honest evaluation of a situation, you must get out your own natural reaction to things. You have to forget about yourself. Forget about what works for you. Forget about what drives you, what pulls you. If you want to really intellectually analyze the situation, don't get personal about it, right? As long as in the conversation, the analyzing of what should be the direction we should go, you have your own agenda, your own natural response to things. That's bribery. That's intellectual bribery. You're bribing because your agenda is bribing and affecting the conclusion of how you're going to conclude the situation in the valuation. And what is shoichet? What's bribery do? It does not allow for there to be truth. As long as you have an agenda, the agenda dictates, and no matter how you're going to argue it, and all the explanations you're going to give, it's a screen that does not allow a person to get to the truth. What is the truth? Forget about your agenda. Let's just honestly analyze the situation. Because I have an agenda. My agenda, what is my agenda? I want to prove that I'm right, that my agenda is right. So you're going to constantly argue, and your mind works that way, right? The Gemara says that Rabbi Shmuel was supposed to be a judge for a woman who brought him a gift a day earlier, and he asked her, why do you bring me the gift a day earlier? She would bring him eggs or something. So he said, or she'd bring him, maybe even paid for it, I forget. But the idea is she did him a favor and came a day earlier. He said, why? Well, I have a court case by you. I figured I'd drop it off early. He didn't sit in as judge because he said, no, that's shochat. That's already agenda. I'm going to find reasons to believe her. And he sat in the case, in the stands. And he said that while he was listening to the case, he had 100 reasons why she was right. She could have argued this, she could have argued that. He kept on thinking of ways to prove that she's right. Why? Because he was bribed. This is what it means that bribery blinds the eyes of the wise. We're not talking about a person who thinks that they're wise, but the Torah calls them a wise person. But when you get bribery, when you have an agenda, it blinds the eyes of the wise. Even after he got the bribery, the person hasn't lost, he or she, the title of Chacham, of wise. It's not that bribery makes him stupid. The bribery affects it causes that you should look at things in the wrong way. You look at it how a blind person looks at it. You don't see the truth. And therefore, doesn't just mean money. Even if it's praise or whatever it is, any kind of agenda that clouds your judgment. What is the greatest agenda of all? The greatest bribery of all is self-love. What works for me? right? When someone comes to you and asks you a question, and the valuation is how you benefit from it, that itself is bribery. It's your agenda. It's very hard to take yourself out of the equation. Ubefrat specifically, kasher pliny, when so and so, page 44, Soivar Cheres disagrees with you, and you're having a conversation. It's the best thing you could do is prove that you're right. So you're constantly manipulating your own mind to the conclusion to what you already pre-understood in the first place. We have an example brought down. When they came to Rav, in a question if this is permissible or not. In the Gam Kasher Harav Poisik, the Isser, even if the Rav, so to say, says the rule as it's prohibited, nevertheless, because he makes it prohibited, right? Let's say someone comes in with a chicken to the rabbi and says, Rabbi, is the chicken kosher or not? If the rabbi says it's not kosher, there's a loss of money. We're not allowed to argue with the Rav. But what? So what happens if you come to the Rav and he asks the Rav, is this kosher or not? The Rav says not kosher. Okay, good. When the Rav comes and says the law that you owe so and so money, all of a sudden you start arguing with the rabbi. What do you mean I owe this person money? I'm right. He's wrong. She's wrong. Because when if I take a personal loss, okay, I take a personal loss, but I should take a personal loss and at the expense that the next person has a gain. Because all of a sudden it comes out from the person the victory element. I have to be successful. I have to win. So too when you have an evaluation in your mind. You want to be victorious and show that your way of thinking is right. That prevents a person from coming to the right conclusion. We'll finish off with this. This is the story of the spies. Even though they believe, says God is bringing us to the land, and God can do anything. Their belief in God was an encompassing; it hasn't internalized. Why? Because they had an agenda. That agenda prevented that their belief in God should penetrate to action. What was their agenda? They were scared of the Nisayan. They personally were scared of the Nisayan of the test. So notwithstanding knowing that there's God, and notwithstanding knowing that God could get them through it, but they knew the test. It wasn't that there wouldn't be a test. The test would be there. But you have to have belief that God would give you the koyach, the strength, to withstand the test. That to them, they couldn't handle that. So therefore, even though it clouded their judgment, they let their own fear of the test dictate how they came to a conclusion. And what was their fear? It wasn't that they were scared physically. They spiritually were scared that we wouldn't withstand the test. So because they were scared that they wouldn't withstand the test, so what happens? You start off, so they knew that God could get them in, but they couldn't internalize it. And why? Because they had an agenda, and their agenda was they were scared of nisyanis. They were scared of the spiritual nisyanis. So even though it started off as a holy agenda, then it goes to a power of an agenda, not non-kosher, until it turns into an impure agenda. As it's brought down, it's brought down in Chazal that what was their personal agenda? It started off that they were scared of the test. They were scared of the spiritual test. But also they were scared that maybe they'd lose their titles. And Moshe would say, okay, your job was only as spies. Now we need new leadership. We're coming to a new land. They only saw themselves as leaders of desert environment. They weren't land environment. They weren't society environment leaders. Mamish, this is things that we suffer from till today. So they thought they would be demoted. And other people would become in. There are other people more qualified for the situation. That's no longer a holy agenda. And never, because they were scared of their own jobs, they were ready to go against what Hashem wanted. Vacha Yeslam Inin Shal Avodah Zara. Pish Rashi Nitnu Rosh Lashon Have Avodah Salilim. So much so they said, let's leave God. If this is what's at risk for us personally, maybe we don't need the whole story. With Pashtus Yaser, Hapaniya, and the more simple, the Rebbe says, Shapaniya Shahaisa Etzel Magnum He Ha Gufa. She's Tarchel Haschel in Chadash Leihurgelbay. They were Pashut scared to start a new way of life, a way of Nisyanis. Hepechtivim, which was against how their nature was. Kifisha Hitva Kadosh Baruch Hu Shaharegel Naseteva. That what they used to becomes their nature. They became used to living in the desert, or even in the Egypt mentality was easier for them. Told what to do under power, at least there was rules, there was seder. Now we were expected to go and create enterprises. They knew they needed miracles to be successful, to beat all the environments of the nations. So what do you mean you're scared of miracles? You're scared that you need miracles. You left Egypt, there was miracles. And daily they had miracles in the desert. Man, the clouds. Every day they had food. All the benefits they had, miracles that they had constantly. That became normal to them. You read this man. When it comes to the miracle of the man, the Rebbe says 45. They only had man in the morning. That was a miracle in the morning. What's have to do with the rest of the day? The rest of the day, thing with life was regular. You read this man, even though that no matter how much they collected, it was always the same amount. They had to make it into edible food, meaning they baked it, they cooked it. They had to do all the things of baking. The man was a raw material. They had to use it to make it into food. Even though there was not everyone had to do it, there was different levels, and they were tzaddikim. It wasn't like they opened their mouth and the man fell into their mouth. They picked it up, they brought it home, they put it on the kitchen, they had to make it into food. When it came to the meat. And also, it wasn't like they could have had another miracle. Why did God have to make them hungry? So they had natural responses to things. They needed to eat. If God wanted to, he could have made a bigger miracle that they would never have to eat. The fact that they had to eat, hold on, Aaron, so that means that they felt the need, so they felt like their life was regular. In the world to come, there's no need for food. They just sit in heaven and bask in godliness. They don't need food. Yes, Aaron.
Why did they give him those things? Like you said, he had to give him to cook it and to eat it, but they didn't make him go to the bathroom and they didn't make him change his clothes.
Say that again.
Okay, so you said they had to make him, and I never knew this until you said it, but they said you had to cook the food, they had to make him hungry, but at the same time, they didn't make him go to the bathroom and they didn't make him change their clothes.
That's a good question. So they had a lot of miracles, but the point is that they had a lot of things going on in their life that was regular. So when you have some things that are regular, all of a sudden you kind of create a regular comfort zone. The point is people have miracles all the time in our life. And become accustomed to it, and it kind of integrates kind of patterns into our life, and we stop looking at it as a miracle, right? Because you have your day-to-day activities. So that's what he says. Because a lot of their day, things were just regular. You're right, they didn't go to the bathroom in clothing, nevertheless. When they looked at Eretz Yisrael, they couldn't apply the miracles that were happening daily. This happens to us all the time. That we can't apply the miracles that happen daily in our life to when we look at the obstacles in front of us. What do you mean? You're right now you're experiencing a miracle. Why are you worried about the obstacles? But because you get used to the miracles, the obstacles you see, and you say, well, I'll never have no miracle can help me get out of this situation. What do you mean? You have miracles happening all the time. Why would a second miracle not happen? But that's just not the way people think. So therefore, the miracles that they needed for Eretz Yisrael, they were scared. They wanted to stay in Eretz Yisrael. I have to go, guys. But okay, we'll finish. We're going to go a little further. This is the lesson. We have to go through a natural way of things. Sorry, we're not supposed to rely on a miracle. We must make vessels to our parnasa, to our livelihood. We get sometimes used to the natural way of things. And what we get used to becomes our nature. A person may think you get used to life and you think that you forget about the miracles that are happening, and all of a sudden you look at the things in front of you and you say, how am I supposed to overcome these obstacles, especially when it comes to serving Hashem? Therefore, we answer him. You must know the nature that you're so used to and comfortable with, that's also God. He runs the world. Nothing happens just that's the way things are. Nikras, things just happen to happen. It says in the Torah, if you come to me as things are kriyas, it's just happening. Nothing is just happening. God chooses it to happen. A person must know. God takes us to the land. God watches over everything that's happening to us in every detail. So if everything's happening until now, don't be worried about what's going to happen in the future. The Rebbe says, he continues, and if God was able to protect us against the 31 kings back in the day, you don't worry, God will stand with you on the difficulties you have in your own life. We don't just wake up and say, thank you, God. We go to the shul and to the study hall. But when we leave the shul and we go to work, all of a sudden we get overwhelmed with the natural way of things, and we feel, how are we going to get through the day? And you have to take the belief that's in our hearts and that's with us, bring it into our mind and our hearts, and it should actualize in our actions. And that's how a Jew goes strong in their ways. Don't get overwhelmed with the world. We know, don't worry, they've lost their image. God is with us. Don't be fearful. That we merit the Knesset to enter the land in our own personal redemption and the greater redemption, to the true redemption with the righteous Mashiach, in our actual space, speedily in our times. I got to go. A good Shabbos and a good Chodesh. Take care.